The following program is a Town of Colonie television production of the William K. Sanford Town Library.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
I love to tell is a story about a baby. And as a grandmother of 5, I get to see babies a lot. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the story when I finish telling it. So I'm going to take off my glasses, if that's okay with everybody. Can you see me better now? So Krishna, and many of you know Krishna as the blue god, it pleased Krishna to come to Earth as a baby. And of course, as a baby, he needed a mother and a father. So he was given to Yashoda and to Yashoda's husband, and they raised him from infancy. And when Yashoda accepted Krishna, she already had a little boy named Balarama. And as Krishna grew up, Balarama was given the responsibility of watching his little brother. And as little brothers can be, Krishna was a bit of a pest. And Balarama and his friends often would ask Yashoda to please not force them to take care of this little baby boy. And as a toddler, he would follow his brother around everywhere. He idolized Balarama. And one day, he was following Balarama and his friends, and the boys were climbing trees. They were climbing plum trees, and they were picking the plums, but they didn't want to eat them yet. They were going to save them for later. So they were up there in the tops of the trees. Of course, Krishna was just a baby. He was down at the base of the tree watching all of this, and they would throw the plums down to the ground. Well, pretty soon, one of the boys said, "Balarama, look at Krishna." And there was Krishna sitting on the ground, shoving those plums in his mouth as fast as he could. And the plum juice was dripping down his chin. Oh, he was as happy as could be. But while he was picking up those plums, he was also picking up dirt and shoving that in his mouth, as babies will often do. So the plum juice was mixed with dirt. It was dripping down his chin. And the boys said, "Krishna, stop eating those plums. They're for us. We're saving them for later." And Krishna wouldn't stop. So finally, Balarama yelled, "Yashoda, come get your baby. He's eating dirt." And you know there's nothing to get a mother out of the house faster than to hear that her baby is eating dirt. So Yashoda came running out, and she picked up that baby, and she looked at him, and she said, "Krishna, open your mouth." Krishna wouldn't open his mouth. "Krishna, open your mouth. Krishna, open your mouth." You asked for it. So the baby opened his mouth, and Yashoda looked in. And what did she see? But the entire universe spinning around in Krishna's mouth. She saw the sun, she saw the earth and the other planets, she saw the moon, she saw down there on the earth, she saw India. She saw her own village. She saw herself holding that baby, and that baby's mouth was open, and inside his mouth was another universe, another earth, all the planets, the nebulae, everything spinning around. She saw shooting stars. She saw, it just made her so dizzy, and she couldn't take it anymore, and she said, "Krishna, close your mouth." And he did. And she looked at this baby. "Who are you?" she asked him. And she held him to her breast, and she went inside. And the boys watched this, and they wondered about babies and mothers. And that's the story of Krishna. Oh. The universe in his mouth.
Oh.
Yes, and the story I'm going to tell actually is a story that I write about in the book. And before I tell it, I just want to say it's so interesting to take something that is written, that I wrote for reading in a book, and now bring it out and have it be a story for telling. And so it's slightly different, but here it is. I want you to imagine a cabin, a small cabin, not in a city, not in a village, but in the middle of the woods, on a hill, looking over a lake. The nearest town is 11 miles away, and the nearest neighbor is 2 miles away, and there's no electricity. This is the cabin that Jay and I moved to in 1968 in the Adirondack Mountains, on 1,000 acres of land with 36 other buildings and a crumbling dam. We had come there to renovate this historic old summer resort with the hopes of having families eventually be able to come and visit and stay there during the summer. So that first winter, we got there in October, the end of October 1968. And by the end of December, I began to learn about a new kind of cold. We had one stretch where it was 30 below zero every night, and it never got to above zero during the day. It was bright sun every day, but it never got above zero. And I began to learn about a new kind of snow. And I'm from Buffalo, New York. You'd think I would know it all, but end of December, there was this one afternoon where these tiny little flakes started falling. And our neighbor, 2 miles up the road, Carl Hathaway, he said, those are the flakes you got to be careful for. The big fluffy ones, no problem, but these are going to accumulate. And he was right. Within 24 hours, we had 3 feet of snow on the ground, new snow. And I began to learn about a new kind of lonely. That snow that I mentioned, it was pristine around our cabin, and the only footprints that we usually saw were those of Jay's and mine. We were the only ones there. I had grown up in a puppy pile of 4 brothers and sisters and myself, and dogs and cats and horses and goats and the occasional hen or bunny rabbit hopping around. And it was constantly chaotic fun. And now here I was with my closest town 11 miles away and my closest neighbor 2 miles away. We got into town maybe once a week. And I was learning a new kind of lonely in this pristine snow. Well, my mother caught wind of our being there, of course. I mean, we would talk to her all the time and wrote letters. Yes, we wrote letters in those days. And she wanted to come up and see this place for herself. So in February, we planned a visit. Before she came, I sat at night with Jay in front of the fire one night, and between us was the kerosene lamp. And I said, Jay, where's Mom going to sleep? We don't have room for her in this cabin. He said, how about David's cabin? David had been Jay's really good friend growing up, and in this little enclave where our little cabin was, only 20 feet away, was another little cabin that David had stayed in when he came up to visit Jay in the summer. It wasn't insulated, but it was small, so, and it had a potbelly stove and a bed and a table and a bureau. That's about how big it was. So there was some hope for maybe having it be somewhat warm. And my mother was an intrepid traveler, so I thought she could handle it. So we got it ready. Jay got all the firewood he could to have the potbelly stove be prepared, and I looked around for every blanket I could find. I found 3 heavy wool Hudson Bay blankets, the kind, and 2 other blankets. And I found some curtains in a box, and I hung them up and put little knickknacks around the window. And the day came for Mom to arrive. I was so excited. I couldn't wait to see her. She was driving from Buffalo. I knew she wouldn't get there till the afternoon. And when she came around the corner and parked in front of our cabin, I put on my parka and my boots. It was above zero that day. And I went outside, and when she got out of the car, it seemed like all was right with the world again. because with her came this flood of memories of that puppy pile, chaotic childhood. And then she turned around and she reached in to get her blue and white cooler. Oh, good, she'd said she was going to bring dinner, and she did. And it was always the same, and I loved it. It was loin lamb chops, which we would cook under the broiler in our gas stove, and curried cream potatoes, which were her specialty, peas, and then for dessert, her signature butterscotch brownies that melted in your mouth. Well, we had that dinner, and then we sat around the fire talking about family, catching up on Buffalo news, and Jay and I telling about what we were going to take her to see the next day. And finally, it was time for bed. So I said, I'll go over with you, Mom, see if everything's okay. We had gone earlier, of course, and we had started up the potbelly stove, so when we got over there, it was quite toasty and warm. It was nice, and I shoved in as much more wood as I could and made sure Mom was all settled. And then I came back, and the next morning, I woke up. It was barely dawn. I looked at the thermometer. It was 10 below zero. I was so curious about how she had done during the night. So I put on all of the clothes I could find and my parka and my boots. I know this is repetitive about the parka and boots, but it's what we did. And I went outside, and my breath was just taken away with how cold it was. And when I stepped in the snow, it crinkled, it crackled, almost like I was stepping on potato chips. And I walked across the snow, and I saw on Mom's cabin that all of the windows were frosted white. I knocked on the door, no answer. I opened it. Good morning, Mom. And from that mound of blankets, I saw her head lift up. Her nose was a little red. It was not exactly warm inside anymore. And she said, good morning, dearie. I said, okay, stay there. I knew if I didn't say that, she would be out of the bed and out the door looking for firewood. Stay there. And I opened the potbelly stove, and there were some embers, and I stirred them up and put in more wood. And then I ran over, jumped on the bed, wrapped myself in a blanket. How was your night, Mom? Oh, dearie, that was the best night's sleep I've ever had. My mom always said this. When we gave her a gift, oh, this is the best present I've ever had. When we cooked her a meal, that's the best food I've ever had. And Christmas time, sitting around the Christmas table in our dining room with the red satin tablecloth we used every year, and the Christmas tree over in the corner. At some point, there would be a rare lull in the conversation, and then Mom would look over at the Christmas tree, and she would say, that is the best Christmas tree we've ever had. And you know, every time she said that, she believed it. So I believed it too. Well, we spent the next 2 days showing Mom around. That first morning, we all got in the Land Rover, and we drove. It took a mile driving, still on the 1,000 acres of land, to get to where all the buildings were that we wanted to renovate. And as we showed Mom the main lodge, 3 stories with broken windows and the shingles falling off and the door on its hinges kind of leaning, I looked at her eyes as they got kind of wide. And then we showed her the building with the roof caved in from too much snow a few years earlier. And her eyes got even wider. And I saw reflected in her face everything I had felt when I had first arrived there. Could we do this? And Mom said, do you have any help? And Jay said, yeah, we have a couple of guys helping, and we might be getting some more. Well, Mom stayed with us for 2 days. And we knew it wouldn't be any longer because my father always got very antsy after 2 days. And as a matter of fact, on the second afternoon, the phone rang, and it was Dad. And when Mom got on the phone, he said, Libby, where's my underwear? And we knew it was time for her to go home. So the next morning, Jay said goodbye, and he took off to go work in one of the buildings. And I helped Mom pack up and carried her empty cooler out to the car and her bag. And we had a big hug. And then she got in the car and she started driving down the dirt road. And as I watched her, I started waving. That's what we do in our family. We always wave when somebody goes, and we wave until they've disappeared. And as I was waving, I saw the window on her car go down and her hand come out in her arm, and she started waving. And we waved and we waved until she disappeared around the corner. And with her disappeared the memories of that puppy pile and that chaotic fun. And I was left in this silence and these tall, dark pine trees and a question. Would I be able to do this alone? So I turned to go into the cabin, and as I did, I happened to look down, and there in the pristine snow was the footprint of Jay from leaving that morning, and there were my footprints. And then there was another smaller footprint. My mom was small. And something about that footprint made me know that even though my mom had disappeared around that corner, that she was not gone from me. She would never be gone from me. And I would never be truly alone.
One of my favorite stories. I started telling this story because I'm from a large family. I have 9 brothers and sisters, and we are 7 sisters. And this is a story about 7 brothers. And I was able to tell this story at my father's graveside. And I felt that it was an important reminder, not just to my brothers and sisters who were all there, but to everyone to look out for each other and bring each other home. So this is called The 7 Ravens. And when I told it the other night, I said there were 8 of them. And I was like, where did the 8th one come from?
Just flew in out of nowhere.
It makes finishing the story interesting, I guess. There you
But
go.
isn't it true, though? You're telling a story. It's like, why did I say that? So now you know some secrets of storytelling. So once upon a time, one of the few stories I begin with once upon a time, so I'll say it again. Once upon a time, there was a family of 7 brothers. And they were very typical boys. They loved each other, they hated each other, they played with each other, they shoved each other around, they helped each other with their homework. They did all the things that you would imagine 7 brothers would do. And their mother and father loved their boys very much, but every time the mother was expecting another baby, everybody, including all the boys, hoped and prayed that this time she might have a girl. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a baby sister? So, once again, the mother was pregnant for her 8th time, and everybody was hoping and praying for a girl. And sure enough, when the baby was born, it was a girl, and everybody was very happy until they saw that the baby girl was not well and perhaps might die. And the boys were very scared. The mother and father were very upset, and they sent for the priest and they sent for the doctor, and they sent the boys out of the house. But before they sent the boys out of the house, the father wanted to give them something to do, and he reached on a high shelf, a shelf that the boys must never ever touch anything up there, and he brought down a beautiful crystal pitcher, and he gave it to the oldest son, and he said, take this pitcher to the well and fill it with water and bring it back so the priest can baptize your little sister. And so the boys went out to the well. Well, when they got there, they started to push and shove. Each one of them wanted to have the honor of lowering that pitcher into the well to get the water to baptize their sister. Well, in their pushing and shoving, that pitcher fell into the well, and they watched it disappear into the black water down below. Well, none of them wanted to be the one to go in and tell their mother and father what they had done. So they stood there arguing and talking about it, and worrying about it until finally they said the youngest one was going to have to go in. Being one of the youngest ones, I know how that feels. But the father and mother, meanwhile, are in the house with the baby. Everybody's very upset, and the father is wondering where the water is to baptize the baby. And he says, those boys are no more use to me than a flock of ravens. And as soon as he said that, he saw 7 ravens fly by the open window, and he knew that he had cursed his sons. Well, as luck would have it, the little girl did not die. In fact, she got well. In fact, she grew up to be strong and healthy and smart and all the things that they had hoped for in a little girl. But they never told her about her brothers who had disappeared on the day she was born. Well, as she grew up, she went out into the village, she made friends, she went to school, and she started to hear rumors. And she came home one day and she said to her mother, is it true? Is it true? Do I have 7 older brothers who disappeared on the day I was born? And her mother said, yes, it was true. And she said, I'm going to find them. I'm going out into the world and I am going to find my brothers. Oh, no, you're much too young. Stay home. Wait until you're older. No, I have to find them now. Well, that night, while her mother and father were sleeping, the little girl went into their room. And on the table next to her father, she found his little knife, and she put it in her pocket. And on the table next to her mother, she found her ring, and she put that into her pocket. And then she went into the kitchen, and she found a loaf of bread, and she wrapped that in her handkerchief, and she put that in her pocket. And she found a chicken leg, and she put that in her pocket too. She didn't want to be hungry on her journey. Well, the little girl traveled. She traveled so far. She went far, far to the south, and it was so hot. And the sun burned down on her. And she called up to the sun, "Sun, have you seen my brothers?" But the sun said, "No, it's much too hot here. No one can survive. I've never seen your brothers." So she traveled to the north, far, far to the north, to those barren mountains. And it was so cold, and the moon shone down coldly on her. And she called up to the moon, "Have you seen my brothers?" And the moon said, "No, it's much too cold here. I've never seen your brothers." So she went to the stars, and they twinkled. They were so friendly as they twinkled above her, those constellations she'd been looking at all her life. She said, hey, you stars, have you seen my brothers?" And one of the little stars said, yes, I look down on the earth and I see everything, and I have seen your brothers. "Well, where are they?" she asked. "They're living inside a glass mountain." "A glass mountain? Well, where is it?" "Well, I don't know," said the star. "Everything looks the same down there. I just see shapes and things moving around. I can't tell where things are, but I'm sure if you walk far enough, you'll find it." So the little girl walked, and she walked for days and days and nights and nights. She walked for such a long time until finally, in the distance, she saw it sparkling in the sunlight, the glass mountain. It had to be. What else could it be? And she went to that glass mountain, and there was a door. And she tried to open the door, but it was locked. And she poked her finger in, but it wouldn't reach. And so she looked around for a stick or something on the ground, but then she thought, my chicken bone. Because after she had eaten that chicken leg, she had put the bone in her pocket. But when she reached into her pocket, the bone was gone. She looked everywhere. She couldn't find it. So she took the knife that she had taken from her father, and she cut off her pinky finger, and she was able to put that in and work the lock till the door opened, and she wrapped her hand in her handkerchief. And she went inside the glass mountain. The door closed behind her, and everything was silent. She couldn't hear a thing. Outside, she could see the trees blowing in the breeze. She could see the clouds. She could see the blue sky. She could see the birds, but she couldn't hear anything. It was so quiet. Can you imagine what that would be like? And as she walked up through the glass mountain, she came to a staircase, and she climbed to the top of the staircase, and there was another door, a wooden door, and she knocked on the door, and the door opened. And a funny little man came out, and he said, "Oh, you're here. they've been waiting for you. Your brothers, they live here in the glass mountain. And he brought her up to the top of the mountain to a room. And in the room was a big table. And the table had 7 chairs around it. And in front of the chairs were 7 plates. And the man said, wait here. And he left, and she looked around this strange room. It was at the top of the glass mountain, and it was open to the breezes and the sunlight and the bird song. And the man came back, and he had a loaf of bread and a pitcher of water, and he put a piece of bread on each of those 7 plates, and he filled each of the goblets with some clear water, and then he left. And the girl, who was very hungry by this time, went from plate to plate, and she nibbled just a piece of the bread so no one would notice. And she took a little sip of water. And in the last goblet, she took the ring from her pocket, and she put it in one of the goblets, in that last goblet. And then she went and hid in a corner of the room, and she waited. Well, she didn't have to wait for long. Soon she heard a whirring of wings outside the window, and in they came, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 black ravens. And they stood around the table. They stood on those chairs, and they started to peck at the bread and sip the water. And they said, somebody's been eating the bread. And they looked in the cups, and they said, somebody's been drinking the water. And the littlest raven put his beak in the cup, and it came out with a ring on his beak. And they looked at that ring, and they all recognized it. Could it be? Has she come? Has she found us? Will she bring us home? Well, the girl couldn't stand it anymore. She stepped forward. She said, I'm here. I'm here, my brothers. I'm here to take you home. And they huddled around her. And at that moment, they all turned back into boys. And they hugged her, and they kissed her, and they loved her more when she showed them her hand and how she had sacrificed her finger so she could rescue them. And the 8 children went home in great celebration. And that's the story of the 7 ravens.
And I guess this would fit under the sticky situations category, I think. So when Jay and I first moved to the Adirondacks in 1968, we began hearing about and learning about Virgil and Caroline Bartlett. These were names that went well back in the history of this piece of property. They were the first people that ever set foot that we know of. Of course, there were Native Americans before that, but who came to this same property in 1854. That's when they came. And when they came, they couldn't come by car. There were no roads. There were no automobiles. The river, the water was their highway. And they came from Saranac Lake 15 miles away, so they had to paddle or row upstream 15 miles before they could step out on the shore of the river right before it went up the rapids and up to upper Saranac Lake. They wanted to build a place for sports, as they called them then, which were men usually, but men and women who wanted to go out hunting and fishing and just being out in the wilderness. And they wanted to have a place where they could come and spend the night and have good food. Caroline was a great cook. So that was their intention. But when they stepped on the shore in 1854, there were no buildings. They just looked at this forest of deep pine trees, virgin pine trees, huge pine trees, went up well over 100 feet, every one of them. And they knew that they would be sawing those down, literally sawing them with cross-cut saws or chopping them with axes to finally build the Sportsman's Lodge, Bartlett Sportsman's Lodge. Well, when Jay and I came, over 100 years later, in 1968, we had buildings. We had 37 buildings. None of them were the ones from Virgil and Caroline's day. They had long gone. But we did have these buildings, and we knew we needed to do something about renovating them, and we were not sure yet exactly what that would be. But as we looked at these buildings and we started thinking about which would we keep, which would we tear down, we were thinking, I know I was, and I'm sure Jay was, we never talked about it a lot out loud, but could we do this? If we put in all this time and effort and money, would it work? Would people want to come? And I'm sure Virgil and Caroline must have been wondering the same thing. I have no doubt of it. Well, fast forward 12 years to 1980, August 1980. We had made it work. We now had 9 houses. We had gotten rid of a lot of them, but we had 9 houses ranging in size from 2 to 5 bedrooms. We called them lodges, and each one was self-sufficient. Each one had a kitchen, a dining room, a at least one fireplace, bathrooms, indoor plumbing, electricity. It was great. It was the works. And we had families that loved to come. They came back year after year. And they wanted to come when their other families that they'd met there came, because now their kids were friends. So during the summer months, it was just packed and everyone was having a great time. Well, on this one day in August, it was a stormy day, a dark and stormy day, and it was raining. If you were here in Albany, New York today, I would say it's raining like today, only even harder, just torrential rain and wind, not just a little breeze, but this wind just whipping around the trees. So it was quite a day, but Jay and I were up at the club running around as we usually were, taking care of this and that. And at midday, we finally managed to find about a half hour that we could go home. We lived about half a mile away to have lunch. So we were having lunch when there was a rap on the door. It was Pete. Pete was our right-hand man, maintenance guy. He supplied the firewood. He took care of the grounds. He fixed things when they needed fixing. There he was at our screen door. Jay, you've got to come now. You know that pine tree right outside of Hemlock Lodge, the big one? It looks like it's going to fall, and it could fall right on the roof. Jay went to the phone. He called up Carl. He was our neighbor 2 miles up the road, and Carl was a caretaker up there, but also a woodsman. He knew a lot about trees and how to take them down in the right way. And Carl said, I'll be right there, and I'll bring Tom. Tom was his son-in-law, and Tom knew a lot about the woods as well. Jay and I got in the truck. We followed Pete and went right up to the club. And when we got out in the parking lot, I heard something. Now, you may have heard the wind in pine trees, you know, a breeze going through them, that sighing or whispering sound. That wasn't what I was hearing. This was a howling, a real howling up in the trees, and I looked up and the wind was just whipping those top branches back and forth, and the whole trunks of these trees, they were just swaying back and forth. We ran over to Hemlock Lodge. It was one of our 9 lodges that we had. This was a little one. It just had 2 bedrooms. We had just finished renovating it about 3 years earlier. Jay had just built a new staircase going up to the porch and put in a kitchen, and I'd sewed all the curtains, and here was this pine tree that was about to fall on it. It also had a family that was staying in it, George and his wife. George was a scientist, and his wife and his kids and dogs, and they'd all managed to get out. They were out, but still inside was the mother and baby opossum that they had brought up with them, and we didn't dare let them go back in to get the opossums. We just had to hope they would be okay. So we ran up, and there was Hemlock Lodge, and 15 feet away, here was this tree, this pine tree. It was so big, that trunk, that 2 people standing on either side could barely touch their hands. And up about 20 feet, the pine tree, the trunk split into 2 trunks that went way up about 100 feet altogether. And each of those 2 trunks was about the size of one regular size tree. And at some point, no one knows exactly when, those 2 trunks that were like this, down at the bottom, they started a crack into the main trunk. And now with the wind whipping the top, the crack was growing by the minute with the wind whipping up there. And they knew they had to do something. So Jay and Tom and Carl got into a huddle and started a quick talk about what they were going to do. Pete went to get the bulldozer, and then they got some ropes and tied them around the tree, and they began to winch the tree back and tie them to other trees so it wouldn't fall, they hoped, on Hemlock Lodge. They wanted to try to make sure that didn't happen, and they wanted to winch it away from these other buildings over here as well. And then Tom got a ladder, and he put it up against that big old craggy bark, and he started climbing up the ladder with a 3/4-inch rope coiled at his waist. He said, I had to get up there to stabilize the tree before we could cut it down. And he said when he climbed all the way to the top, by this time, by the way, all the guests from all of the lodges had heard of the commotion and come out. It's still pouring rain. Nobody cared. And they're just watching this drama unfold. And there is Tom climbing up this ladder, and the wind is whipping, and they could see the tree swaying. Would the tree knock the ladder and Tom down? Would the wind whip him off? Would he make it? And he managed to get up there. And he said later, when I got up there, and I was right by those two trunks, it was like a mouth opening and closing, opening and closing. And somehow he managed to get the rope around those two trunks to stabilize them before they could cut the tree down. And as he started down, this great sigh of relief from everyone watching. And meanwhile, Carl had been pacing off. He judged that tree about 100 feet. He paced off 100 feet, and he figured exactly where he wanted that tree to fall. So it would go between these other buildings and definitely away from Hemlock, and hopefully not hurt any building in its fall. And he stood about 100 feet off with his pipe in one hand and his axe in the other, and he said, yeah, she's going to fall right about here. Well, once all that was done, Carl and Tom started up their chainsaws, revved them up, and those chainsaws. Now, I don't know a lot about how to cut a tree down, but I know there's a way you can do it to hopefully make it go in a certain direction and not in another direction. Something about wedging, and I just don't know. But they knew, that's why they were there, and I was just watching. And so those chainsaws started screaming and whining, and it seemed to go on for the longest time. And every once in a while, one of the chainsaws would quit because they'd run out of gas, or another one would get stuck, and they'd have to figure out how to unstick it. And then they'd be screaming and whining, and then finally, the chainsaw stopped. Tom and Carl had done whatever they could do. And everybody watching looked up at that tree, and as if choreographed, they started backing up because the tree began to lean, just slightly at first, and it started to groan as it was leaning. And it leaned and it groaned, and it leaned and it groaned. And then the top branches started cracking against other branches as it hit it, and then finally, whomp! That tree landed on the ground. And every foot felt the reverberation of that fall. It had stopped raining, but quite a few people were wiping their eyes, not because of the rain. And then George's little girl, the one who'd been in Hemlock, she walked up to the tree, and with her little arms, she tried to hug it the best she could. And then others came up and laid their hands against the craggy bark of that tree. And then George, the scientist, said, let's go find out how old this tree was. We all thought that was a great idea, and we went over to the stump of this tree, this huge golden yellow stump with this pungent scent of pine sap coming up. And he started counting the rings with a lot of help from little fingers, so he had to start over a bunch of times. And finally he finished, he said, 126 years. That's how old this tree was. 126 years. That meant this tree started growing in 1854. The same year that Virgil and Caroline stepped out of their boat onto the shore on the hill below and looked up at that pine tree forest and thought, about the building that they would build. Little did they know then that while they were standing there up on another hill, a little shoot was coming out of the humus and the soil, a little shoot that would grow for 126 years. And little did we know, as we stood there mourning the loss of this giant, smelling that pungent pine sap, and looking up at the gap in the sky where this tree had just stood. Little did we know what little shoot might be coming out of the ground right then somewhere else on the property, some little shoot that would grow and grow and grow. And who knew what story that tree would have to tell?
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, but I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round,